how gangs basically use digital spaces to convey their identity, to recruit, and basically to do everything they do in the offline space and how they are turning it online. So that's what I've been exploring in the last couple of months. This project is called Glocks, Animal Emojis, and Rulay, how Carter-related gangs recruit young Ecuadorians through viral content on TikTok. Why did I pick this name? You'll see later how we're gonna encounter different symbols, among them emojis of Glocks, emojis of little animals, and certain jargon that is used in specifically Latin American gang culture. Sorry. Give me 1 minute, yeah. Okay, there you go.
Thank you.
So this is a project that I'm working in the OII as part of my ESRC Digital Good Network Fellowship. I'm part of this basically, this is a network of researchers and professionals in industry, in politics, who basically want to understand what is the digital good and also are looking for ways to measure it. How can we measure the digital good? First of all, what is good? What is good in the digital sphere and how we can measure it? In terms of my research project, I'm doing kind of the opposite. I'm not trying to understand what is good. I'm trying to understand what is bad. Because in order to understand what is good, we also need to understand the opposite of it. You know, what contrasts whatever we consider good. So in this case, I'm trying to understand risk, how risk is perpetuated and symbolized in digital spheres. In this case, the specific example that I'm using is the example of gangs, of gang culture, and how gang culture penetrates the society in Ecuador and Latin America, especially among young people. So a little bit about the research team. As Lily mentioned, we are a multidisciplinary team composed by myself, but also researchers in the OII, in this case, Scott Hale, who's my host as part of my fellowship. I also work with Chico Camargo, who is a professor of computer science in the University of Exeter. Ned Westwood, who's a postdoc social data scientist, who recently moved to the University of Miami. He was in Exeter before. I also work with analysts in Ecuador, Denise Salazar, who is an MPP from the University of Oxford, Jorge Trujillo, who's a psychologist, and Camila Hurtado, who is researching as well, who's doing research, who's a research assistant in this project. As you can see, I am a digital anthropologist, and I basically try to understand deeply certain cultural characteristics in the digital sphere. But in order to do that, since we're working with data, we're working with large data sets, I need help from computer scientists. I can do this by myself, since I need to process, first of all, gather and then process large amounts of data. So all the insights that I get from my mostly qualitative research can be extrapolated and scaled in terms of, I would say, thousands, even millions of data points. So we'll start with the case of Ecuador. I'll try to give you a little summary of what has been happening in the last couple of decades in the Ecuadorian context. Ecuador, in the last decade especially, has become a strategic gateway for drug trafficking in the world. Since the beginning of the last decade, Ecuador has established itself as a global drug trafficking capital, to the point that nowadays, basically 70% of the world's cocaine is shipped from Ecuadorian ports, mainly to the US and Europe. As part of this basically growing market, we have seen a Cambrian, what I call a Cambrian explosion of cartel-related gangs in the country. And this didn't happen from day to night. This is something that is the result of various historical processes that we've had in the country in the last couple of decades. So we would say one of the main factors that started or that positioned Ecuador as a drug trafficking capital was basically that we are close to Colombia, which is the main producer of cocaine in the world. We're just next to Colombia. We're at the south of Colombia. And basically Ecuador has become part of the system of drug trafficking in the world. In the beginning, basically who controlled the drug trafficking market in Colombia was FARC, which was this paramilitary group that used to operate in Colombia until 2016. After they had a treaty of peace with the Colombian government, they ceased and stopped the drug trafficking market, but the Mexican cartels took over that market. So nowadays, who operates in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, and all the countries that are part of the system of drug dealing, who lead these markets are the Colombian cartel, the Mexican cartel, sorry, which are two mainly, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación and Cartel de Sinaloa, Sinaloa cartel. And basically, we will see how everything, like all the gang violence, all the fragmentations of gangs, basically stem from these main two players. So from 2009, when these cartels got established in Ecuador, we could see a relative monopoly of one gang who was leading the exportation of cocaine basically in the countries of Ecuador, who was called the Choneros. Basically, by then, the president of Ecuador was Rafael Correa, who was left-wing, who basically ran a left-wing government, and who, as part of his strategy, to gain sovereignty as a country, he kicked out basically a U.S. Navy military base, and basically what he did to compensate the work that the U.S. Navy military base was doing to regulate drug trafficking, he basically signed an agreement with the main actors of gang violence and basically drug trafficking. So that was the beginning. So from 2009 to 2017, there was relative peace in terms of violence in the country, since there was an agreement and there was one monopoly that was controlling the drug trafficking in the country. But from 2017, the next government that was led by Lenin Moreno, he basically just stopped this agreement, and he decided not to make any more agreements, not to negotiate with what he called criminals. So the government started a war against criminal groups related to drug trafficking. Apart from that, there were other factors, international factors, transnational factors that also affected the situation in Ecuador. One of these was when in 2017, the Chapo Guzman was the leader of the Cartel de Sinaloa. He was moved to the U.S. prison, and from there, especially the cartel de Sinaloa lost a lot of power, and then there was this new player that was Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación that emerged as a competitor of the Cartel de Sinaloa. So nowadays, by then, we not only had by then, who had the monopoly was the Cartel de Sinaloa, but after the extradition of Chapo Guzman, then they started a competition that became a war that many of us may be aware that it's going on, still going on in Mexico. But as you can see, it extends to the rest of the continent, especially those countries that were always part of the drug trafficking and production cycle. Then 2021, there was a new government, Guillermo Lasso, right-wing conservative government, who basically established harsh measures and military intervention against everyone who was related to drug trafficking. By then, basically who were in charge of drug trafficking in Ecuador were the local gangs. These gangs have always been there. They had relative strength. They were mostly, they were violent gangs, but they didn't have like a big budget. They didn't have a big logistic system. But since the cartels, the Mexican cartels arrived to Ecuador, they were injected capital, they were given guns, they were given intelligence. So now we were dealing with real criminal groups that were eventually considered or labeled as terrorist groups. And here, the military intervention started. And it was like a very, very tough war against basically violent groups, criminal groups. But after that, there was even more fragmentation in internal warfare. Why? Because these harsh measures, basically the consequence of these harsh measures was the elimination of some of the leaders of these gangs. We may say that this was a solution. Once we get rid of the leaders, that's it. The organization is gone. But the business was still there. The money was still there. There was still demand in Europe. There was still demand in the US. So someone else had to do the job. So then came from 2023, there was a very noticeable fragmentation and internal warfare, because the sub-leaders that responded to the actual leaders were given autonomy. So they took over the market. And then there was an internal warfare, and that ended up basically making of Ecuador nowadays the most violent country in South America. So this is like, by then, after that, violence got out of control. Gang violence became part of the mainstream, to the point that there was an event in the beginning of 2024 when a group of gang members raided a newsroom that was basically broadcasting live with basically a message of "we are in control." This was seen by the whole country, and immediately there was chaos, basically collective chaos around the country and in the region as well. And this became the new normal in Ecuador. After this is like, I would say, like a milestone in gang violence in the country, because here is where gang violence was not something that was underground. It became mainstream. It made it to the screens, to the big screens. They were in control of that newsroom. They were in control of, and that was a symbol of being in control of Ecuadorian society. And that's where the war against criminal groups intensified. And basically these gangs that respond mainly to these two cartels in Mexico got further atomized. And nowadays we have more than 30 gangs that are dealing drugs, that are working somehow together, and somehow with conflict among each other with the Mexican cartels and also the Albanian mafia, who is also like a big player in drug dealing in Ecuador as well. So what you can see here is an official, basically chart of how these gangs have been atomized through time. So you can see here how they started. Well, it's not you can see the whole chart, but it started as like two main branches, and then just like it branched out, and nowadays we have like all these gangs that are like small gangs. Some of them work together. They just like getting conflict among each other. So it's like a very, very difficult situation. It's an ever-changing situation. Whatever happens today in terms of like association of gangs will not be the same tomorrow. Everything might change. So it is nowadays it is very, due to the fragmentation, nowadays it is very difficult to point out who works with who is related to who has the control, who is the leader. So it's out of control. It's very difficult to understand, at least in terms of organizational systems, to understand, to grasp what is the current situation of gangs in general. They are spread out in the whole country. Some gangs basically dominate certain geographical areas, but most of the gangs, as you can see, operate in the province of Guayas, in the coast of Ecuador, where basically which is the main port of the country. So most of the violence is concentrated in this geographical area. Guayas is basically the most populated province. The capital of Guayas is Guayaquil. It's the most populated city in the country. Not the capital, but the most populated city, and basically the economic capital due to the ports and the customs. So nowadays we can say that Ecuador is experiencing what we can say a golden age of narco-culture. The lack of opportunities for the most vulnerable sectors of the population, combined with cartels' promise of rapid economic success, has shifted the values and aspirations of Ecuadorian citizens, particularly among the youth. Consequently, violence has exacerbated to unprecedented levels. And now, here's where we can start going and understanding the role of social media, the role of media culture in what's going on in Ecuador. It's not all happening in the streets. A lot of it is happening in the streets, but since the streets are more and more policed, they are now the streets in Ecuador are militarized. Gangs need to find another way to express who they are, to create community, to create identity. And social media play a very important role in this. Basically, this is the function of social media that they are using. And this is a transnational issue. This isn't something new. This isn't sui generis in Ecuador. This is something social media has been used to radicalize people for decades now. We could see the case of ISIS in its moment. They used Facebook to recruit very successfully many people across the world. In the case of Mexico, it's also the same happened in Mexico, basically. So nowadays, what's happening in Ecuador, it's the Mexican cartels nowadays are applying what has been working in Mexico in terms of digital strategy. So now we can say this is a digital strategy. What has even been called narco marketing, because this is a system. This is a system. This is something that has already worked. There is professionals behind this. It's not only like gang members who are just like trying to get engagement however they can. There's money behind this. There's capital behind this. There's intelligence behind this, and this is like a very important part of it, because this is something that we can also explore as researchers in social sciences. Basically, it's not all about social media. We can also say mainstream media also has played a huge role in this. What social media does is just extrapolating this, making this basically helping the public or the users gain autonomy or gain power over what they are shown in mainstream media. So we can talk about series like Narcos, for example, that has basically been popular all over the world, romanticizing the life of Pablo Escobar, and other big cartel leaders. And this has had a very, very deep impression in young Ecuadorians, because after all, especially those in vulnerable situations, in vulnerable communities, because as I was mentioning before, this life promises a big and fast growth in economic terms, and also it provides you with respect. That's something that many people in vulnerable communities lack or find difficult to find. We also have mainstream artists and rappers like Peso Pluma. Nowadays we have this big genre of music called narco corridas, which is basically a music genre that emerged in Mexico, and basically has become very popular in the whole region. And basically the lyrics are just straightforward, how we deal drugs, how we are violent, how we kill each other. It's very, very straightforward. And nowadays, this is one way in which narco culture is not only celebrated, but it's also normalized. Because people, even though you may not enjoy the lyrics or agree with what they say, you start accepting it. You normalize it. You hear it, you like the sounds, you like the rhythm. That's it. It has lyrics that may be secondary. So that's how it gets normalized. And that's also like a very important factor in terms of the widespread, the growth of narco culture in the region. So, as I was telling you, this is cartel TikTok, as it has been called in the literature. As I was telling you, this isn't something new. This is something that started already in Mexico, in the context of Mexico, and they, in terms of literature, it's been called cartel TikTok, which has been relatively well explored. But in terms of Ecuador, this presents a big opportunity to start early, because what is happening in Ecuador is like what has happened already in Mexico 10 years ago. It's starting to happen in Ecuador. So this is just starting. This phenomenon is just starting in the context of Ecuador. So it will be very valuable to start understanding as early as possible what's going on, what are the mechanisms they use to spread gang culture in the digital sphere. So policymakers, educators, and every stakeholder can address this issue as soon as possible. Why is cartel TikTok such a big phenomenon? This is, in terms of gangs, this is what they always look for. They look for ungoverned territories. Wherever there is a territory where the government is not present, that's where gangs basically colonize. That's what gangs colonize. Those territories where the government is not present, when there are no clear rules, where there is no law, or at least perception of a law. So if we see the digital territory as a legitimate territory, we can start seeing that basically TikTok ticks all the boxes. What they need, what criminal groups need to conquer a territory, that's basically what's going on. It's all the requirements that they need nowadays are present in TikTok. And this is a problem of public policy as well, because from my experience talking to policymakers, there's still not a sense of or a perception of the digital territory as a legitimate territory. The digital is still seen somehow as something secondary, as something, even a space for leisure, and not really as one more territory that is as important and as crucial as the offline territory. So the fact that it's not tangible, the fact that it's still, that we can see it, here among us, makes it difficult for policymakers to grasp the real consequences that social media consumption may have in society. So TikTok has become a hub for culture-related content creation, despite that the platform efforts to ban harmful content. We know that every social media platform makes a great effort to censor or to moderate the content. But the problem with cartel TikTok is that the content is not, that evidently violent. If we can see the content, this is the kind of content that we can encounter in the Ecuadorian context of cartel TikTok. So mostly what we see is just emojis, emojis, animal emojis, and messages that are not clearly violent. And this is a problem in general of platforms. The moderation is so centralized and not that culturally specific. So basically what happens with platforms is that they have a blind spot with culturally specific phenomenon, like the case of gangs. We should know that also gangs, beyond the online, one of the strengths of gangs is their capacity to create symbols that can change over time, that mutate over time, because this is crucial for them. They need to create identity, but also they need to protect themselves from getting caught, from getting identified. So basically, it's always shape-shifting. And this is also difficult in terms of, we were talking about content moderation, whatever is a gang symbol, even if we get like culturally specific, whatever is a gang symbol today, it might not be a gang symbol any longer tomorrow, because they are always, once a feature or a symbol is identified, that symbol is changed, is modified. And this is like why it has been like very difficult for platforms like TikTok to moderate this kind of content, and we can see it, and that's the reason why actually this research project is possible, because the content is out there, it's out there, it's visible, we can see it every day, and it's not necessarily violent. So there's no blood, there's no people being murdered, but it's very, very, very bluntly suggestive, and in terms of how people perceive themselves as part of a criminal group, how they perceive themselves even as criminals, and how this is part of their lives, of their daily lives, and how these kind of symbols represent an important part of their own identity. So the rationale behind this research project is that within the Latin American context, most effort, as I have shown you before, most efforts have concentrated in just, being violent against these gangs, just basically warfare, military intervention, eliminating the leaders. And this hasn't really worked, as we can see. It has, furthermore, this has even make it more difficult. This has making the problem more complex. So one of the reasons for me to, the reasons why I got interested into this topic is that it was, this is like a new or a different alternative, a different perspective that we can offer to policymakers and to stakeholders to see this project, to see this problem, and to understand that it is that being a gang member, that a gang is a more complex issue than we usually assume. So usually members of narco culture are assumed as a one-dimensional bad character that must be targeted as an enemy and to be eliminated without necessarily, dig deeper to understand the structural factors that draw them to this life. So this is what I'm trying to understand here. It's not, as it has been portrayed so far in the Ecuadorian context, it's a matter of good versus evil. So it's like the good guys who are the military, who are basically superheroes, who are saving us from the bad actors versus the bad actors who are just basically, evil. They are just evil, one-dimensional evil actors. But from the findings that I've been encountering, I can see, the complexity that encompasses being part of a gang. So the objectives of the research is understanding how gang symbolism is translated to internet language, identifying the different roles users play in online recruitment and their most effective tactics, assessing the impact of gang-related content on recruitment goals, and detecting risk factors that draw Ecuadorian users towards cartel TikTok. Why does this matter? As I was telling you, TikTok is a blind spot for Ecuadorian policymakers due to its ultra-personalized algorithms. Many of the policymakers I've talked to had no idea, had no clue that this was happening, that there is actually a big gang culture on TikTok, that there is users who are actively recruiting young people via TikTok. And this is because of the nature of the platform. This is what TikTok is all about. It's just very, very specific algorithms, very specific content that is shown to you according to your interests. So if you're not into gangs, if you're not into any of the themes that relate to gang life, you will never be shown this kind of content. And this is why it's somehow, even though the problem of narco culture is everywhere, in spaces like TikTok, it is basically invisibilized, because basically we don't have the capacity to understand the whole universe of TikTok, because it's so personalized. As I was telling you, this digital territory is not considered a legitimate territory. Content curation is still managed in a centralized manner. And I'm not saying that understanding basically gang culture in TikTok is gonna, basically save the world or just, save Ecuador from gangs or from violence, but it's an important piece of the puzzle that we are still missing. The digital part, the digital life is part of everyone's life nowadays. Countries like Ecuador has a big penetration of internet access, more than 80% of the population. So it's no longer a problem of, the digital problem is no longer a problem of access to the internet. It's no longer a problem of being able to use the platforms, because, platforms like TikTok are just very easy to use. They are just like, almost instinctive. But it's a matter of knowing what's being shown to you, learning how, having the knowledge or having the criteria to know how the algorithms work, to know and to learn to be critical about the kind of content that you use. In order to do that, you need a certain level of education in terms of how you use platforms. And that's something that is also, part of the goals of this research project, trying to basically shed a light on this particular issue. Most of the users use their social media platforms very like indiscriminately, you know, we're just zombies just scrolling up. But it's very difficult for users to stop and say, you know, what kind of content is being shown to me, and if this content is actually being constructive or destructive for my life. So here's where other issues like algorithmic inequality also play a role, you know. Does your position in the world really is a factor? If it's a factor that somehow determines if your social media use is being productive for you, or if it's being basically destructive to you. You know, how important is the place where you are in the world to define the use of social media in your life. So this is what basically draws me to, this is like the most systematic way I can explain what the project is about. And this is what I've called the TikTok narcosphere, which is, you know, how the narco space is, what are the actors in the narco space and how we can understand them. So my perspective, I've taken a perspective, you know, where the user is the center, where the user is the main subject. And I'm seeing the user in the context of a prosumer, which is, and that's what social media users are. We are prosumers in social media because we produce and consume content basically exchangeably. So we can, one day I can just like, you know, be a very passive user of social media where I just like scroll. I can just scroll even without, you know, just leaving likes. I can just scroll. I can like, I can share, but I can also create content. So each, in the case of this research project, each social media user is seen as basically an actor that works in the side of supply, but also in the side of demand of content. It's specifically talking about narco culture. So we have on the one side content creators, and on the other side content consumers. So this division is important because like we need two different lenses to understand these two sides of the same user, basically. So in the side of the content creation, you know, this is a side that, you know, I coined it as like a supply area where creation is, where content is created. And here, in order to understand this part, it has been useful for me to understand it. First of all, like, so we have, yeah, we have like a spectrum where the supply of the content creation can be very systematic and very intentional, but there is also a non-intentional, a very organic content creation dynamic that is going on in Cartel TikTok. So we have accounts that actively and systematically use language to recruit and to work as propaganda for gangs. But there is also another component of those users who consume this content and who basically start liking it, who start enjoying this content, and who start feeling identified by gangs, who also create content in a more organic way without being paid, you know, without being basically forced to share content. They just like do it because they feel identified with gangs, because it's a source of pride, it's a source of identity. So we have this spectrum that I would call it like that goes from the marketing, from the more marketing perspective, which could be also called, you know, like psyops, but it also goes down to a more advocacy level where users are just advocates or, you know, ambassadors of gang culture, and both are as important, as a phenomenon in general. So in terms of this is in terms of supply, and in terms of demand, we need a more. Here's where we need a more anthropological perspective. So the side of supply is mostly a marketing, basically a marketing perspective, but on the side of the demand, here's where we need a more anthropological take on this issue, because here's where we're trying to understand what's drawing the user towards this side of TikTok, towards this side of the algorithm, what are basically the characteristics of the audience? In these terms, I would call it an audience in terms of digital. What are the characteristics that make them prone to be attracted to this kind of content and eventually advance more and more towards being part of it, if they are not part of it yet? So here, what the methodology that I've been using is ethnography, the ethnographic approach, as a way to explore the digital sphere. And I've used the theory of technocultures that has been proposed by Robert Kosinets and Gambelli, where they define specific, basically, items, or criteria that we should focus on if we want to understand behavior in the digital sphere. And here are some variables I define those criteria as variables that I'm observing when I'm going through the content that I'm analyzing. So we have affiliation, basically what gang do they belong to, or what gang do they feel close to? We have demographics, symbolic vocabularies. Here we can see, we can consider hashtags, we can consider emoji, not only individual emoji, but also configurations of emoji, because it's as complex as that. We have different configurations of emoji, like basically used like hieroglyphics, that if used in a right order, they basically mean something, and if used in a different order, they mean something else. So that's how complex it gets. That's how complex the gang symbols get in the digital sphere. We also have sensitizing stories. That's something that we're gonna see later on. Basically, those stories that resonate with the user. Those are stories that when the user, and that we can see patterns of those stories, the same topics over and over again, that are basically telling us what matters to them, What are those stories that tell you something about what it's deep inside their own individuality? We're also exploring their networks, how they are interconnected with each other. This is like something that the more computational part of the analysis deals with, how these users are connected to each other, and how well connected they are, how tight or how loose the points are in the network. The influencers that they follow, this is also very important nowadays, because influencers and accounts nowadays can be considered like a symbol of the interests. So if we say Lionel Messi, we know he's a football player, but he's many things in the minds of the people. So we can say he represents football, he represents brands, like sports brands, he represents success, he represents luxury. And it's the same with every influencer. So that's also why it's very important to understand the role of influencers in the digital sphere, and what is basically their role and what they represent as symbols. Technographics as well, what kind of social media they use, basically their patterns of use, and the affordances that they have. So for example, in terms of TikTok, what are the affordances provided by TikTok for you to communicate with others? So we have likes, we have reposts, you can post, you can use music, you can use video. So all of those are affordances, and that's something also an important variable, how these users basically appropriate these affordances for them to communicate who they are and to communicate their sense of belonging. We also have routines and rituals. That's something that we'll see as well. That's something that we can just basically those practices that we can find patterns. We can find patterns of practices among these users, and that also points out what matters to them. What are the sources of their identity? What they do in their daily lives, and this is very powerful because it's telling us, from all the activities of their daily lives, what are those that are important for them to be shared with the world. So this is also like something very powerful that the that understanding or that studying social media provides us. So where do we start? Basically, how do we get there, right? So we need an initial exploration. We need to start with some kind of background, get to this content. If I'm not into GANs, how am I gonna get there? How am I gonna get to that part of the algorithm? So we started with an initial exploration based on literature and GAN culture and mainstream accounts as well. The more mainstream, the better in the beginning, because we start collecting all these terms, all these hashtags, music, which is very, very important in TikTok, because music, I don't know if some of you are users of TikTok or research about TikTok, but basically music, if you click on the music that the user posted, you can see every user who has also posted on that music. So basically a song, if you go to the right song, that song can be basically a package of users, basically could be a package of an audience, a very well-packed audience, depending on the specificity of the song or the sound. So that's also very important. So that was like the initial exploration, and then we were identifying entry points, and then we started gathering symbols, all right? And these symbols are, as I was telling you, emojis, mostly animal emojis. We prefer to use, in terms of animal emojis or very general emojis, we prefer to identify configurations of emojis, so it's not only just a lion, but also like a lion with a knife next to the lion, or a lion with a demon next to the lion, so these are telling us specifically that this person is showing their affiliation to the GAN culture. And also with the same with keywords, the same with symbols with status, and as I was telling you, the importance of songs as well, right? Because that's the thing about GAN culture. Nowadays, each GAN, which I forgot to tell you, each GAN in Ecuador, the name basically is based on animals. So that's why we have animal emojis. Should explain this in the beginning. So for example, we have tiguerones, which means tigers. We have tiburones, which means sharks, lobos, which means wolves. So that's why we see these animal emojis everywhere, because the emoji is like the perfect language for them, because basically we have all the animals in emojis nowadays, and there's more like a growing list of emojis, which is making them, even easier for them to express, their affiliation and their sense of belonging to gangs. So we were looking for these animal emojis. We were looking for these configurations of different emojis, specific keywords, specific hashtags, specific slang and jargon that they were using. And once we created a glossary of all of these and basically a database, then we use those as an entry point for data extraction. This is what we did. We extracted a list of posts, users, and comments via third-party APIs for analysis. We're talking here about large data sets, very, very large data sets of thousands, hundreds of thousands of posts, thousands of users who were using this language. We filtered it specifically for users of Ecuador, and that's basically what we've been analyzed since. But there is since we are talking about large data sets, we have different, and we have a few problems that we need to solve in order to understand this. So the thing about the gang culture is that they only, in terms of emoji and symbols, these symbols are not only present in text, they're also embedded in images and the videos. So it would be very difficult for us. We would need like an army of researchers to process each video and to identify manually the emojis and the symbols present in each video. So here's where we need the help of LLMs. Basically, we use the GPT API, which has been surprisingly very accurate in terms of identifying symbols and items and objects, sorry, in video and in images. So we use the API, the GPT-4 API that has been working well. So we fed it with this list of emojis and configurations of emojis, and it helped us identify those emojis from each of the videos of the dataset. So that has been a very, very helpful way to start using LLMs with the purpose of scaling up the research process. And this is the part that is still in progress, but the cultural understanding, we want to understand culture at scale, you know, so we aim at cultural understanding at scale. So here, what we're gonna do and what we've been doing so far is we're creating, based on all this criteria that I presented here, we have created code books with text, hashtags, emojis, all the objects that I presented, so we can train. So here's where the anthropological part can help us basically create insights or get insights at scale. So we use the ethnographic method to create a very elaborate code book that we will feed and that we've been feeding to the LLM for it to start applying this code book in large data sets. And so far it's been effective, it's been interesting, it has helped us identify very, very interesting features of the narco culture. So this is what we've been doing. And it has, so far, you know, it's experimental, you know, it's something that we're trying, it's something that we are, you know, trying to see, you know, what are the limits, what are the affordances and the limits that it provides us. But so far it's been very useful to scale up all those insights that we've been gathering so far. And what are the findings so far? We have different kinds of findings. Basically, I just created like 5 different categories of the findings that we've encountered. So first of all, we identified, of course, a digitalization of gang symbols and rituals. It's interesting how gang members are very creative at the moment of using social media to translate those offline symbols to the web. So that's very interesting. Something that they are trying to do is translating signs that are basically that emerge offline. They are translated it to the online sphere. You know, and as you've seen, they've used emoji as one of the main ways to achieve that. Also, I've identified their most important factors of identity, values, and aspirations, attitudes towards violence and risk, and the division of labor for recruitment. And also, I've seen the influence, like a clear influence and reference to transnational cartels, to Mexican cartels. So in the digitalization of gang symbols, we can see the appropriation of some emojis. So for example, a very like important and common emoji that we can find is the ninja emoji, which is, of course, initially, I think it was conceived as a ninja, but this has been reappropriated and used in the context of crime. So some users use the ninja emoji to reference criminal activities, to say, I'm a criminal, you know, I'm into criminal activity because of the ninja, not because, you know, of what a ninja means, but because it looks like a person with wearing a balaclava, you know. So that's how they are reappropriated, the ninja emoji in this case, you know, and they've been reappropriating different sorts of emojis in that way, you know, just adjusting the emoji to their specific context, so it will mean something specific that will make sense to them. It's the same with the signature emoji as well. So that's basically one of their codes or jargon is una sola firma, which means one single signature, which refers, you use that when you are referring to the big leaders. So the leader is the firma mayor, or the highest signature. That's how they refer to the leaders. So whenever they want to refer to the leader of the gang, they say una sola firma, you know, and they use the signature emoji. So that's how they use it. That's how they use emoji in a very creative way to convey whatever they say offline in the online sphere. We also have symbolic warfare. There is some posts where we can find that in the comments, there is members of different gangs basically just, you know, fighting each other. Also, the posts themselves respond to a long-term, you know, basically war, where, you know, like basically they just insult each other in posts. You know, they just say, okay, these tiguerones are, you know, dead, I'm gonna kill them. Something like sometimes very straightforward, other times a little bit more subtly. It's also become a place of worship and contact with the underworld. So we can see we have identified many accounts that have like a thematic, they basically based on religious, but not religious, but sometimes even more Santeria, which I would say like ritualistic accounts. So we see how, you know, there's many posts kind of like referencing the Santa Muerte. Santa Muerte is in Mexican culture just a saint that represents death. And we can see that these accounts have a lot of engagement, a lot of comments, and many of the comments talk about, it's just people saying, please kill this person who killed my son. Please, you know, I need revenge. So it's a place of worship. There's even some accounts related to Satanism, where also some users pray to satanic images or symbols for revenge, for power. So it has also become a place of worship. Also, many users also identify themselves not only as members of Ecuadorian gangs, but also like they refer to the cartels, to the Mexican cartels, like Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. And also, it is a place for mourning over the deaths of relatives and fellow gang members. Basically, as I was telling you, Ecuador nowadays is the most violent country in South America. Also, there's a lot of victims, direct victims and collateral victims of gang violence. So it is very common that users who are close to gang culture have lost someone, relatives or friends in basically gang warfare. And it has become a big space for mourning over the dead relatives in terms of comments, but also in terms of like original posts. We have also identified items of identity, values, and aspirations. We've identified, and to me this is very particular, the central role of mother figures. Many of the users refer in very ambiguous ways to their mothers. Some even kind of like try to rationalize their role in gang culture as gangsters or as drug dealers with the idea of providing for their mothers, for giving their mothers a better life. One day I'm gonna be rich, so my mother will be comfortable. One day I'll make it, so my mother will finally have a house. So there's a lot of work that is referred or that is somehow at least referred in social media as a direct work to improve their mothers' lives. But there is also on the other side other posts that talk about negatively about mothers, just criticizing their mothers for because she didn't care much when they were young, or because she was violent, or because XYZ. So, but in general, there is like a central role of mother figures here. There is also display a very like clear display of luxury lifestyle aspiration. Also a culture of suspicion. We can see many users just deliberately posting posts which basically say, never trust anyone, don't trust your neighbor, don't trust your friends, they may betray you one day. They even have a term which is sapo, which means toad, and they use the toad or the frog emoji to say, to call out those who report gang members to the police. Snitches, basically. That's the way they refer to snitches. And they are like the most hated, basically, actors in gang culture, snitches. And they constantly refer, to those snitches who are always around. They don't know who they are, but they are always around. So they're always telling them, don't be a snitch because you're gonna get killed. And that's very common. That's like a defense mechanism that they use against snitches in general. And there is also a lot about willingness to change. So some of their posts, not all their posts are about violence or about pride of being a criminal member, but some of them are also reflective. And they show that sometimes they just don't like that life. Sometimes they just some users that we've identified as part of gangs are even in drug recovery groups. This one, for example, you can see he's saying, I'm just recovering from drugs, but also he's also posting, his membership to gangs. So there is like it's not black or white, it's just like it's a very difficult sense of belonging, where they belong, but sometimes if they had the opportunity, they might be doing something else without losing their sense of belonging, the sense of belonging that gangs provide, because in the end it's a community, and even though you're being a criminal or not, you make friends there, you meet people there, and that's also something that some users, even though they want to get out of that life, they still appreciate the role that they play as part of a community. We also identified attitudes towards violence and risk. We can see a lot of glorification of violent figures. This is one of the most iconic violent figures in narco culture in Ecuador, which is called Fito. He was now he's in prison, in high security prison, which means he might not, he right now, he just fled from prison and nobody knows where he is. But now he's like an idol in gang culture. He was the leader of the Choneros for a long time, and he's basically praised like a god. Also, finding pride in illegal behavior. This post says, basically, I sorry to all those people that I've robbed to. So it's just basically just, and they are dancing in the background. So it's just like, like a celebration of criminal activity, I just like, yeah, even though they know they were doing something wrong, they still like celebrate it. As as we saw before, mourning over death of relatives and fellows, state of readiness towards death. That's also something very common. There's, every other post, you can see users reflecting about the fact that they are always at risk when they are part of gangs, and then they might be killed at any time. And that's something that is very common there as well. So they are basically telling their relatives, telling their friends that, someday they might not be there anymore. And that's something that is always in their mind, as we can see. And there's also gamification of violent behavior. Here's like a gang member who posted basically a video of his child holding a gun in a playful manner. So I've identified all of these as attitudes towards violence and risk, which help me, understand the different levels of violence that we can encounter in digital language, specifically in gang culture. And we also identify the division of labor for recruitment. Basically, some users, so here we have different layers. From the most systematic, as I told you as I told you in the beginning, from the most systematic to the most organic kind of behavior and sense of belonging. So we have those accounts who are like bluntly systematic recruiters who just basically posting, just telling users to join. They usually post this kind of like very, very heavily populated posts full of emojis, AI generated images of animals, where they're inviting users to join. There's also active gang members who are not necessarily saying join us, but who are displaying, they're basically how the gang life is exciting and how it makes you rich. Gang supporters who are not necessarily showing any sense of real belonging to gangs, but who still somehow have some wishful thinking of being part of gangs, of one day being part of a gang. And also narco lifestyle dreamers. This is users who have not shown any kind of affiliation to gangs, but still like all those little symbols that are part of gang lives, like for example, sports cars, money, even they just they dress their children in that fashion. So they're like narco lifestyle dreamers, and also the outcasts, who are users who are connected to these users who are part of gangs and who are just displaying this sense of being unrest, of feeling that they don't belong to society. And these users also you can see, at least in content consumption, these users don't post, but consume culture-related content. So just because of time. So what's next? So what we're working on right now is trying to find a way to visualize, all these large-scale, basically findings that we found. We are looking for a way to visualize this in a network, which is a network specifically like that looks for a specific kind of configuration that can tell us who is in the center of gang life, which is the recruiters, and layers and different layers of belonging, until we see just those who are lifestyle basically followers and the outcasts. So we can start measuring this. This is the way that we want to scale it in the next couple of months. And after this, we, just end up with further questions. How does this social phenomenon manifest in other geographical contexts? What's the role of class, race, and gender? How can content moderation work in an ever-changing community-centered linguistic environment? Can we measure and predict the direction cartel-related tactics are taking? What's the role of the government and educational sectors in this issue? And is there any countermeasure that can be applied to deter or dissuade users at risk? These are the questions that we've identified that might be of interest for policymakers, for researchers, for further explorations of the topic. And with that, I think that's it for me. Thank you. Any questions, comments?
Have you heard of the American phenomenon of cartelgram?
Cartogram. Yeah, it's basically the same, but on Instagram. Basically.
Yeah, but of Americans, there's a whole subculture of American, just middle class white kids who purposely seek out this content as a sort of, let's see if I can trick the algorithm into thinking I'm a cartel member. It's a very funny, because you just mentioned methodologically, and it reminded me, there's people who just do this for fun, and sometimes it just shows up on my feed and I look in the comments, and instead of cartel members or recruits or something, it's all English speakers saying, haha, I've unlocked another cartel.
Yeah. There's a lot that's interesting, because nowadays there's a lot of playfulness, with certain, parts of the algorithm of social media. I've also seen a lot of that attitude also in white supremacist content as well, where users are not necessarily, affiliated or feel identified with, this kind of content, but, still they find it and they just share it just for fun, right? But this is very interesting what you're mentioning, because that's also a reappropriation, of content, of gang-related content, because it's basically just how people who are outside of the context make sense of it, because that also tells you that there's a level of alienation, behind it. It's just I don't belong, so I'm just separated enough from this kind of content that I just find it funny. Just to me it's a game. While for other people who just find it as a real space for identity, as relevant for their identity, they take it seriously. But that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really, really enlightening. I just wanted to ask, and it kind of connects to the previous question, because you talked about presumption, and I was thinking, what are the forms of presumption or maybe if you have not identified particular forms, I was looking at the way that you're trying to visualize it in the end, and I was wondering, well, are there also levels to categorize this engagement? And then also, how can we, how do you consider your users? Are you thinking then, you talked a little bit about, okay, some people post, some people just consume, but then is there a strategic alignment in the way that people orchestrate their movement?
So thanks for the question, because it's going to help me to better explain this part. So here, the reason why I'm trying to, I'm using K-core, as the index to identify, a core and, different layers around the core, is that, as you can see in the third topic, the third part is we have mobilization potential. So if we apply this to a data set and we apply it and we, keep doing the analysis over time, we can see how users move, from one layer to the other. And that's going to be a very, very important factor for analysis, because that's what's going to tell us, the importance of certain content or of certain attitudes, that what are the most effective tactics, that will draw users from, for example, active members to recruiters, or from getting supporters to active members, because if I identify those users who move in 6 months, I would say, then I can start looking at their content and see what's that content, how their content consumption and production changed and what are those changes that have basically, moved them from one layer to the other.
So then that is through a measure of in-degree connections, right?
Yeah.
Within the network.
Yeah,
And you are not excluding anybody, you are just measuring like up to a certain level.
yeah, so basically like the network would be comprised by just, all the users who are part of the basically of the network of those initial users who are gang members.
Yeah.
So then like what we are seeing here, what we're gonna see here is just those gang members and or all their networks, followings and followees, basically. I think you had a question.
It was exactly that.
Oh, okay.
Oh, great.
Is there anybody online?
Oh, sorry,
Yes.
Not so far.
Noah.
No questions online so far.
No, there's Noah. Noah just raised his hand.
Oh,
Yeah. I don't know if I can, should I ask my question now? I don't know what's going on in the room.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So hi. Yeah, I'm Noah Khan. I'm a visiting student here at the OII and a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in Canada. I really enjoyed your talk. A lot of it resonated with just cultures that were in relation to my youth that I probably wouldn't want to say on a recording. But my question is related to how good, for lack of a better word, the cartel-related video content on TikTok is, which were probably not shown throughout the presentation for obvious reasons. But like, are you seeing high like production value and like platform fluency, which like suggests like real kind of digital skill? Or do you think that like the influence is more about like systemic and platform dynamics rather than like craft? So like in other words, like is there a kind of aesthetic labor happening here that we should like take seriously as part of, narco marketing?
Basically, so in terms of like, can you repeat the last part of the question? Because like I just couldn't hear well.
Yeah, essentially, I'm just asking whether there's like a kind of real like aesthetic labor on the part of individuals making the content,
Right.
or whether the influence that they're having is more related to like the larger systemic or platform dynamics at play on TikTok.
Well, there's definitely like aesthetic labor, as I was saying in the beginning. This is not a new practice, like cartel TikTok is not a new space. It's something that has been going on for years now, that was pioneered by Mexican cartels. And as we can see in this slide, here we can see that's why it is important to identify the level of the division of labor of recruiters, because what you're asking basically, those more aesthetical labor is being developed by the systematic recruiters. So these accounts are never showing faces. They are usually not people, but they are like intensely symbolic. So all these accounts, if you see their feed, is mostly just emojis, AI generated photos, nothing showing a face, but you can see how carefully these accounts convey symbols like emojis, in a way that it's kind of like propaganda. It's like systematic propaganda that is communicated specifically for this kind of accounts. And in that terms, that's where the term narco marketing makes sense, because it's definitely a marketing strategy. There is something behind it. It's not sui generis. It's not like symbols that came out of nowhere. In some cases, right? Not in all cases, but it's in terms of the kind of content that these users post. It's not symbols that come out of nowhere. It's not like deliberate posting. It's very elaborate. Even though it's not pretty, it does resonate with the aesthetic of the audience. So in that term, yes, there's a component in the aesthetical level that is very interesting and is very relevant to understand, because that's what's also telling us, what works and what doesn't work in terms of recruitment.
Thanks.
Lily, I think you
Yeah.
yourself wanted to ask.
Thank you. I know you mentioned briefly that it's difficult for the tech companies like TikTok to moderate this content because it's not overtly violent. But I was wondering if you felt like the tech companies do have a role to play in regulating what kind of content can be shared and then how it's being consumed. And then the other point I was wondering about was, I get sometimes on my Instagram these like anti-influencers who are like trying to de-influence you from things that you might have been influenced on.
Yeah.
And I wondered if there's any anti-cartel talk influencers out there that are trying to like actively push back on these narratives online.
Interesting, excellent questions. So to address the first, I'll address the second one first. Okay, so I've seen those, but from what I've seen, they don't have as much engagement as the accounts that that recruit. I've seen some. Most of them are like musicians or artists. It's just like account or people who are just recovering from addiction or people who have turned into religious life. So some of them just use their accounts to basically just be a testimony of how you can change your life. So they would just post content of themselves just going to work and saying it's difficult. I know it's difficult, but this is how you have to live life. You need to work hard. It's not all like fast money. So you can see like all this kind of content that it is posted, but it's not as engaging as the cartoon TikTok is. And regarding the first question, there is definitely a role to be played by platforms. In fact, platforms like, for example, Facebook, they do have a list of terrorist groups that are banned from the platform. The problem is that all of those terrorist groups are Islamic groups. Anything else, nothing else beyond that. So there you can also see, and that's the problem, of platforms. They have an agenda. They have a specific agenda in terms of companies like Facebook, which is an American company. It might respond to American agenda. But now we have TikTok, and TikTok is a Chinese company, and it will respond to the Chinese agenda. So if the problem of narco culture, so I think there's like two different points there. So the first is like the narco culture. I don't know if it's how important it is for Chinese interests. So at least there's no much to be much incentives to do something. And on the other side, in terms of market, Ecuador, for example, is a small market. It's a small country. So how impactful would it be for companies like TikTok to spend money and effort in regulating the content of a very, very small part of their market? So there is also like economic incentives behind, economic and political incentives that shape the way these platforms are regulated, but they need to be regulated. And it's even in their interest, to regulate content, because otherwise they could just lose users. So that's the thing, it's just like the social media companies are a special case because they are like transnational private companies that operate globally. So they kind of like rule, they just set their own rules within sovereign territories, which are countries, so it's like a very, very tricky space for regulation as well, but that's the thing about considering the digital territory as a territory, because why can't we talk about like digital sovereignty? Why is it easier? Why do we kick out the U.S. Navy base from Ecuador, but just be cool with just TikTok, just not doing anything about cartel content? So it's just like that also reflects the different attitudes that still policymakers have when thinking about the offline and the online world. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much. Really interesting. While you were talking, you reminded me of all sorts of other research. I'm an anthropologist in Japan by training, and there's somebody that's been working on it's sort of, I don't know if people know the term kawaii, cute in Japan, which has kind of been theorized a little bit anthropologically. And there's some research on companies and organizations, for example, the nuclear industry, how they use cute character figures in PR. You know, so they will have a mascot for the nuclear industry who's always very cute, cartoon-like, you know, maybe even a little emoji-like character that sort of becomes this sort of focus for their messaging, public messaging. So that's one thing I thought of. There seemed to be a parallel between that and emojis, that sort of reducing everything to sort of cute. You know, we're in the, I don't know, the cat or the lion or the, you know, friendly animal clan, if you like, or gang. So that was one thing. The other piece of research this reminded me of was, I think it was a master's student here in anthropology that was working on QAnon. And specifically, of course, they had been by this time chased off of social media onto Telegram. And his research was largely concerned with trying to decode what had become a subversive language of communication. You know, that you wouldn't understand unless you were on the inside. And I get a sense of a little bit of parallel here, you know, strings of emojis, coded language that there might be a little learning curve to understanding. So I wondered if that was easy to do through your methodology, if it was challenging to decode what meanings were. And I guess related to that, a methodological question, were you, and maybe one about access as well, kind of thinking ethnographically about this, was it possible to gain access to communicate with individuals who are embedded in these gangs and to draw from their experience and their willingness to talk? This chap was very successful in gaining access. I don't know how he did it, but he was very successful in meeting people and somehow getting along to the extent that he went quite far in decoding a lot of difficult messages. So I just wondered about some of those methodological issues.
No, that's interesting. And thanks for the point, because well, because of the nature and the time frame of this research project, I just limited myself to just observation of data. That's definitely something I'm looking forward for the field, you know, just eventually going to the field, talking to people outside in the offline world, trying to get access to groups like Telegram. You know, basically Telegram is where like everything moves in terms of gang culture. That's actually where all these codes emerge, and they just get to the surface to the mainstream surface in social media platforms, you know, but they all, if we're talking about a core in digital culture, in gang culture, digital gang culture, is definitely Telegram. And that's a big limitation, at least in terms of research. And if we're doing, if we want to do like, you know, we want to work with large data sets, because that's, you know, it's encrypted. So there is no way to access, you know, that data. I can just, you know, scrape that data. Impossible, you know, it's impossible. So that's a big limitation. And that's, you know, the reason why it's, you know, fundamental. And that's, to me, it's like the next step, you know, fundamental to access, you know, to have like direct contact with these groups, with key players, you know, just like interviewing, for example, some of the influencers in the gang culture, you know, which would be like, you know, a headache in terms of ethics, but I think it's very, very, very important. So yeah, that'll be. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
This is hopefully a small question, but I thought that was very interesting that you were talking about you see the central role of the mother figure.
Mhm.
And I come from a gender background, so I was wondering how, if you see that strictly as like a literal mother, or the context that I look at as like the use of mother in right-wing nationalist
Mm.
platforms, so like using that more as a metaphorical, like image or idea of something that is strengthening the community, I guess, or if you were able to distinguish between that.
Is the actual mother. So
Okay.
basically, they're just, considering that's part of what they want, just a better life for their mothers, it's just like there's a lot about, especially like their material well-being mostly, just talking about, I just want to buy a house for my mother, I just want her, what to get her to travel the world. So it's a lot about like providing material goods and material wealth for their mother. That's something that they're always thinking about. That's something that they always, at least they always talk about, openly, to the public. And that's the thing. But as I was mentioning this is also, it's not as easy as, I want my mother to be happy, because like there is also other posts where they criticize as well, their mothers as well, because whatever they failed in when they were like just raising their children, but there's like, this is like double face attitude towards mothers, that's something, to me, is something that I don't have an answer of why this happens, and to me, that's also like a very, very would be a very, very interesting topic to delve into,
Yeah, it could be quite interesting to look into that, because I would guess that even if it appears quite literal, there's perhaps an undertone of it speaking to something.
No, definitely. So you can talk about also like, probably this is like a discussion actually I had with one of my analysts, probably there's like the lack of the presence of the state.
Yeah.
So some of these users might, replace the state by their mothers, since you don't have the state, since you don't have like a big national identity in Ecuador at least, you might better, your symbol, of, who you want to protect or who makes you who you are. It's not your country, but your mother, so that's also like one of the, at least that's one of the takes I have from it, but I didn't go deeper into it, but it will be very interesting to know. Yeah. Yes.
Just quickly on the Telegram, you can definitely scrape a lot from Telegram. There's just been published a huge data set, 120,000 channels have been scraped with open access code, so you could run it on yours. I have a very short technical question on your basic classification model. How are you validating that?
Basically, it's just like it will be like an experiment. You mean like the one that already ran, or the network?
No, the image.
Oh, the image. In the beginning, we basically just went through the whole data set. First of all, we trained it with actual run the theory. We just run the theory in a manual way, and then we just went through a sample of those, basically we just classified a sample of those posts that were already classified, and the level of accuracy was at least 90%. So yeah, it worked well. Yeah.
Sorry. No, good. Thank you for the talk. I have two questions. Small ones though. One is about you mentioned the code book that you put together. I don't know how you call it, but I was just wondering like how, and also you mentioned that the gang context is fairly unstable, but a lot of things are moving. I was just wondering like how quickly the codes move and change within this environment, and especially like how you do the interpreting, because on the slides you had like a couple of emojis and they had multiple interpretations, and I guess in different contexts. And so I was wondering like how do you put together the context within which they appear, if you have only one image, and also, yeah, and especially like when it comes to different gang affiliation and stuff like that, so where that influences as well. And the other question was about ethics of modeling of these things. So because like I can see how it makes sense within the context of the gang activity, but I can see like these two being very easily used, for example, environmental activists mapping the type of the talk or the images that they're using. And I was just like wondering like where do you grapple with these questions and
Okay, so in the, like, answering the first question. Yeah, that might be like a limitation of the research, you know, like the fact that these symbols change more, you know, so quickly. Makes it very difficult for us to, you know, just remain with the same definition of or the same definition or the same, you know, glossary of emojis or symbols, you know, that's definitely like a limitation. And that's something that if we want to do it nowadays, now it's just like, you know, a specific research project. But for example, let's say one day this is applied to content moderation just system. This is something that needs to be worked, you know, over time. There needs to be like, it's an evergreen project, you know, it's like something that needs to be always, since it's always changing and morphing, it's something that must also always be observed and updated, you know, that's knowledge that needs to be observed and updated. But in terms of what we've done, that's why we have different criteria to define, you know, what a post is about. So it's just like, we don't only consider, you know, just emoji, but for example, we also ask the LLM to identify groups of people. Yeah, because that's something also very big, you know, those who are actually members, active members, usually post photos with their groups, with their gang, you know, with their gangs. They, in some occasions, you know, put an emoji in their face just to protect their identity. Others, they just don't. So that's, for example, we're not only considering one specific kind of symbol, but we're considering different symbols, including like actual gang signs, not only emoji signs, the environment where they are, you know. So it's just like we're trying to be as inclusive as possible in terms of what are these symbols that we are identifying, and plus we also have the metrics that the platform offers us, you know. So we're not only this is, you know, the most qualitative part of it, but we're also like the platforms. When you download the data, you get access to the level of engagement, the number of followers of the users, you know, the date where this post was uploaded. So, you know, we try to consider as many as the variables as possible to, you know, get to a conclusion. And in terms of ethics, we went through an ethics clearance process with the OII, where we basically just define what are the limits of the research. And that's the reason why, you know, because of, in terms of the time frame of this research project, you know, it was just, you know, it wouldn't make much sense beyond the digital, you know, sphere, because that would be like a new level of, you know, something that we did really need to think about, you know, and deal with. And that especially the project, this specific project I don't have time to do that in this specific project, you know, later it would be. And, you know, just we're basically what we're doing is just we're taking every measure as possible to protect ourselves, but also to protect the users. So we're not showing faces here. We're not showing usernames. We're not showing anything. We won't be sharing anything because we just don't want to basically just report them to or anything to anyone or get these people in trouble. And in terms of us, we are using Tor browser to process this data, and also the users of the analysts are just like artificial users created specifically for this research project, and we're not engaging at all with any context. We're just like observing. We're not leaving any single like, you know, because that would be dangerous. So those are like the different measures we're trying to take.
Right, we're running out of time, but I think there's one last question.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wanted to return a little bit to the discussion of governance. because I think it links to even the last discussion. I was wondering if your research has been disrupted to any degree by deplatformization, and if that is something that like has shown up, or if, because as you said before, there is precedent of these kinds of techniques by the Mexican cartel, so that means that there is an awareness. But then, as you said, TikTok is a Chinese company, there are different policies, but there has been work by, for example, like Amsterdam researchers on like mapping the deplatformization of content. And since this is like also a part of your research, is that something you've come across? Or is it still something that is not in the scope of your research, or something that hasn't shown up, or are the platforms not caring at all?
I think that at least in the context of Ecuador, that's not something that I've come across as relevant as it is in other contexts, like for example, the US.
Sure, no, yeah.
Exactly, basically, and that's something that that's also like a critique I have
Yeah, for
of the way we deal with social media in general. I think to me, like the perspective is too Americanized. So we are just the whole world or academia in general is like kind of like assuming that the way the social media disinformation, misinformation phenomenon is basically emerges in the US is the same in the rest of the world, but it's quite different. It's quite different. It's not the same. It's not the same agenda. Even politics. If you talk about politics, political leaning varies differently. In Ecuador, we don't have Republicans versus Democrats. We don't have liberals versus labor. It's way different. But from what I've heard, from what I've seen, from what I've read, I think the perspective is giving just too much weight on the way the phenomenon of social media is, or the dynamics of social media are portraying themselves in the US. And to me, that's like a blind spot for research in general. It's just like, it depends on the region, what are the important things we should talk about in terms of digital content.
Okay, we should wrap this up and go around the corner to the Rose and Crown where we carry on over drink, basically. So thank you very much. Let's try and switch everything.